Heartily good morning to everyone that have joined us since we've started a couple of minutes back. My name is Merwe, one of the past presidents of AMEU. I'll be your host for the morning. I'm going to share screen now, and then we're going to jump into the session for the morning. Let me just get to presentation mode. I trust everyone can see. Can I just get a hand, Mpu? Are we there?
I can see it and I can hear you clearly. Yeah.
Perfect. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm going to do is I'm first very quickly going to introduce the presenters and the panel members, and also our international presenters and speakers. And I'm going to ask my fellow panel members, as I mentioned their names, just to bring up their faces on the screen, and then we will continue with it. So I do have a number of panel members. Dr. Leslie Rencontre from Cape Town, the Executive Director, Electricity, Leshan Moodliar, also Executive from eThekwini Metro. Dr. Silas Mulaudzi from Salga, and then Dr. Willie de Beer. Willie is well known to everyone. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we are privileged to have three sets of international presenters. First, down under from Australia, Hamilton Locke Australia, a specialist legal firm that's going to come in on that, but I'm going to introduce them later again. Ricardo Energy up UK side, also going to introduce them later, where a lot of privatization and the changes of the industry have started, but I'll also introduce them later. And then other side of the world, different time scale, CPCS Canada, and then also locally here, Eskom. So heartily welcome to all our panelists, and also the international presenters and the local ones that's going to share with us the activities of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, when we started putting this presentation together, or this webinar, we set ourselves as a learning objective, a particular goal, where we would like to review some of the selective solutions that may come up and that may be discussed today of a Q virus of the EDI, and specifically trying to take note of the learnings from international case studies all around the world. Hence, the reason why we have invited some participants that will share with us also some of these presentations. As learning outcomes, we've set a specific set of activities that we would like to achieve. We would like to share with you around the concepts of bundled versus unbundled, the monopolistic and competitive structures, also ownerships, how this influences the structures and what happens with this, and then of course the changing generic value chain with emerging technologies and the disruptors bringing in a new distributed ESI, EDIs in many places around the world. And in our case, it will not be complete if we don't bring up the sustainability challenges of municipalities, of our distribution sector in South Africa. So our webinar will have three particular parts. We start with a little bit of theory that I will take you through, and at the end of this I will hand over to Leshan Moodliar from eThekwini, where we'll do a poll on some of the challenges, critical challenges within municipalities regarding sustainability. And then right after that, while you're busy with a poll in the background, we're going to jump into part 2, where I'm going to introduce the international case studies from the different presenters that I've already introduced to you, high level introduced to you. I will do it again, plus also Eskom South Africa as part of this. And then straight after this, we will analyze the poll. We'll set the burning platform, and from a burning platform, we will go into a panel discussion. Now, we have tried to design it as such that we've built plenty time for the panel discussions, because we believe from session 1 and session 2, there will be also questions going over into this particular session. And we believe that we would need to try and create proper dialogue Part 3, the chair of that will be Dr. Leslie Rencontre from Cape Town Metro Electricity. Leslie will chair that, then hand back to me, and I will wrap up the story. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, let me take you into the journey, and want to invite you to sit back and relax. So how has the story started? Perhaps if one take it far back, and many of you may have heard of a war of the currents between Westinghouse, the AC man, and Edison, the well-known Edison from the DC side. Here in the late 80s, early 90s, it was basically an argument and a discussion and a fight of which system and which approach between AC and DC is best. Now we know who has won, and the typical characteristics that we've got today is based on that. So the business model that we have in most parts of the world is built on one that was originally started with a view of trying to create universal access to electricity, all built around the initial vertical integrated value chain that bundles cost and try and look at some returns from the various value chain activities. Now, in terms of this, mostly customers are normal captive with little alternatives. This whole design was basically, and still is today, supported by a regulatory paradigm that you cover the fixed cost and fair rate of return on the investments. Now interesting is, you may not know that Thomas Edison's secretary at the time, Samuel Insull, he was the man that have designed the original cost of supply service model in the late 19th century. And still today, some 130 years later, we are still using a lot of that. Now, as we take you through the journey, you will notice towards the end how things have significantly changed from where the storyline has started. And hence, perhaps, we need to reconsider many of it. So the whole system was built around this model of on-selling kilowatt hours. And all you need to do is you reduce some of the kilowatt hours and try and recover your cost. And that is the process. So what have happened here in the 90s, in the 1990s, that the standard reform model was advocated in many parts around the world, where the idea was, or the focus was, that to move away from a vertical integrated public-owned monopoly system, going through some process of commercialization, corporatization, focusing on some independent regulation, and then specifically unbundle the various parts of a value chain in a competitive elements. Now, you will see right through this part of a theory that I'm sharing with you, I'm noting some of the important elements that I would like you to remember in terms of this theory, because our presenters will use much of this when they share with you what is happening in various parts around the world. Also, that came in from the 1990s was the whole focus of, let's see how we can bring private sector participation in. Now, private sector participation, as you'll see later in some of the slides, happened differently in many parts of the world. And then, last but not the least, competition, introduce some form of competition into the system. So the first decade was very much focused on, let's concentrate on the vertical unbundling and see what we can do with generation, transmission, and distribution, and also some horizontal unbundling. And I'll explain again what that means so that we can all enjoy the descriptions of our presenters later this morning. Then competition with some regulatory independence. But interesting is that the last decade and a half, the focus has changed significantly, specifically when renewable generation as an uptake came about, flexibility came in, variable solar and wind, cost reductions, energy efficiencies. So we saw right around the world that renewable energy have started to displace the older generation, and suddenly the importance of markets and the utility model changes came more and more on the table. And we will also talk about the market structures and what we would need to think and understand about this going forward in terms of its new business models. Another element that came up that probably was neglected from the days of Edison and Westinghouse, with a war of currents here in the 1800s, is the issue of distributed generation. And we'll circle back to that because this is an important element of how a lot have changed. And then, of course, the decentralization in the markets. So one may ask the question, why reform? And there are a couple of disrupting reasons and emerging technologies that drives some of the requirements for reform. But there's a lot more. Specifically here where we are in South Africa, two main ones, which I've tried to push up high on this list: the fiscal needs of government. In the first webinar, Dr. Willie de Beer spelled out how our sector is in financial needs, both within Eskom as well as in the municipalities. So the fiscal need of governments, hence some of the rationales why things are changing, is quite important. Shortage of power, economies of scale, competition then is also one of the reasons. Why competition? Remember this one, we need to come back. Requirements supporting capital markets. And this other one, second last one, the knowledge and the funding by trying to bring in some equity support, equity partners in the market. So all in all, a lot of this restructuring is focused in trying to establish a separation between the monopoly and the competitive parts of a market. Now, let's look at a simple example. Typically around the world, the reform is characterized, if you look at the vertical entity of generation on the top, transmission and the distribution at the end, between a vertical separation between the monopoly and the competitive parts of the industry. And still some of them today sits within the competitive part and some in the monopoly part. Typically, one would see that within the retail portion here at distribution, that the focus is there where a lot of the retail is. And our participants, specifically from Australia and also from the UK, will share with you how the retail players in the market also contribute within this particular space. But also we will share with you later as we go through it that within many of the unbundling between wires and retail that looks different in many parts of the world of South Africa, there's a new kid on the block, a new competitor in the form of the distributed energy resources that is coming into the fore. But just remember that concept, that although we've got retail competition in many parts of the world at the bottom end of this chain, there are also some other elements for competition coming in. So around the world, we've got then this horizontal unbundling in the IPP space, here up in the generation chain, with the introduction of markets, market tradings and pools from Canada point, CPCS. Stefan will take you through that and explain how this changed the world where we are living in, with open and fair access to the grid. So one can ask now, all of these things that is happening around the world, what kind of reform was evident within the South African space? Now, clearly, we can also define some definite periods of reform in South Africa, but clearly not to the same extent as those parts of the world. And specifically, if you look at the diagram, if we divide it up into the different periods within 5 or 10 years in South Africa, for the first 20 years, 2 decades, no private sector participation in South Africa. Only after 2010, a reprogram of government came in, where the focus on some private sector participation and some changes in the sector came in. Lately, in the last part of what we are standing of a reform of the changes in the South Africa, and in this last column, I've quickly try and summarize the main effects, and many of you will know it is the Schedule 2 amendments, where exemptions up to 100 megawatts firm, and we've heard that President Ramaphosa announced the rest of opening up of a market, DPE roadmap for Eskom unbundling, DER coming in, distribution energy resources, with with a rising of a pro-consumers and the pro-mangers in this particular roles, wheeling, and in fact, the last period, very little additional bid rounds came into being, only up to round 4, round 5 is in the process with some of the challenges we know with the activities around the car share power deals, but not much more. So the question is, what happens now from here onwards? And this is why we have also set up this particular sessions of today to try and take a deep dive into understand what has happened around this. Now, if I may share with you quite an interesting piece of a discussion that was done in 2015 in the US, that we have also shared in one of our AMEU conventions. It's interesting that even 7 years later, a lot of this is still valid. So let me quickly share with you.
The electricity system is going through a revolution, whether people like it or not. And it's going to have some victims and some winners. It's driven by a powerful combination of technology change, of environmental mandate, of the market growth. The essence of it, however, is that companies that cling to the old ways are going to fail. And we've seen this in Germany, where they've lost.
So what is this different elements, this drivers of change, what Harvey was referring to? I've depicted 7 particular ones there on the screen that is changing the landscape also where we operate. Typically the elements of a green revolution, renewable energy alternatives for IPPs, also the super regional grids. We have heard in the second presentation about SAP and how SAP will also play a role within the South African environment. And then the increasing urbanization or the growth of the EVs that we are also expecting, perhaps not the same in South Africa as in other parts of the world. Behind the meter services, the underinvestment in the infrastructure that is also driving a lot of change in South Africa, and then the 4th industrial revolution. So a lot of these changes comes in not only here in South Africa, but with us also other parts of the world. And interesting what is happening is that a lot of these are actually driven by market forces rather than legislative and regulatory guidances of governments. So we'll find that some of these is coming in, some specifically role players is coming in and playing in in the more profitable segments of a value chain, creating the current model largely unsustainable in many other areas. Also creating what is often referred to as a death spiral where prices goes up and because of the fact that there's lesser sales, suppliers increase prices again, and you go into a vicious circle that makes the utilities unsustainable. And we've seen the same in many cases within the municipal sector and also within some parts within Eskom distribution. So do we have some trends of some of these changes in South Africa? So if we can summarize between generation, transmission, and distribution here on the left-hand side, traditionally, it was only purchases here from the grid, own generation. This has changed lately from purchases from IPPs, the Schedule 2 generation projects that have come up greatly. We read daily of them in the papers. There was today again in the business day an article of 3 gigawatt that is planned to be added by one of the larger role players, and of course then distributed energy resources. But not only on the generation side, also here on the transmission side, bilaterals, wheeling concepts and wheeling projects, a number of them already in places and also playing that was not part of a game and part of an industry structure some 5 years back. In the distribution side, the same. A lot of utilities is concentrating in splitting their businesses in wires and retail. And today, our colleagues from overseas will also share with you how this is the process that is happening in many parts around the world. Behind the meter services, all of these changes are already with us, and all of these are driving part of a business models. So restructuring, ladies and gentlemen, in the global sense, restructuring and the ESI has become synonymous in many parts around the world. We have this evolving utility models, and we have examples of and good learnings of some reform in many parts, the UK, America, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Latin America. And there are different drivers, and I've marked a few here, which I think is also applicable to we here in South Africa. The power shortage is perhaps one of the biggest concerns that is with us almost on a daily basis with load shedding. That brings a typical signal of affordability and reliable energy on the table. And we ask, how do we bring the additional investment and funding in to ensure that the industry is sustainable? This brings us, if we look at what have happened elsewhere in the world, typical the unbundling and the introduction of competition in the generation and the retail sector with private sector participation and some regulatory changes. Now, the characteristics that we also touch on in the first seminar are these elements of competition that brings in actually innovation and change and different approach by the role players. The issue of energy markets, the bundled tariff, the kind of on-selling approach that we had is not a sustainable option anymore because our utilities are suffering in that arrangement. We've seen it has been started 130 years back by Westinghouse and Edison after the war of currents. But the new element on the block, what we need to understand is that distribution is not a pure monopoly anymore. Not only retail competition, but also distributed energy resources, where the customer is becoming the new competitor in the world in the future. Then there's another option that is coming in that is working in many parts around the world, the distribution system operator. And one of our colleagues will also share with us the thinking for South Africa around that particular point. Then a clear distinction between wires and retail and behind the meter services. Now, the next picture is a very old one, and it may not be 100% up to date, but what is interesting of this for me is what I want to leave you with, that we also need to understand here in South Africa, that as the transitional and the change in the market happens, the regulation change, normally from a very high hands-on detail to a different sort of regulation sitting at the other side, with a focus from originally bundled asset-driven to a more customer-driven. Here's a number of countries around the world, and I've already mentioned part of these up here sitting at the right-hand corner. And we've got participants today that's going to share some of these things around Australia, Canada, and the UK with us. Now, we can find today many examples of this evolving and evolution of power business models. I've directed you to some of the very nice articles that you can go and read when we share. Go and read that particular one that I've got on the screen. Quite interesting one, indicating how we migrate from a power system today to the system of tomorrow, all driven by disruptions, decarbonization, decentralization, customer preference. And then another one that is also coming in that I want you to take notice of is this big one, hydrogen H2 sitting there, the new kid on the block. And I've specifically asked Hamilton Locke from Australia to come in and share with us on the repurposing from a coal-fired power stations, and also what kind of role does hydrogen play in that particular area. Go and read some of these background materials so that you can have a very nice and full understanding of some of these changes that is with us. So in the new world where we are living, things are changing. So if we analyze the next picture, we may ask whether the war of currents may be to a lesser or a bigger extent in reverse. At the bottom part, we have the more centralized generation activities, large hydro, coal fire, utility scale batteries, that is all part of a non-intermittent power resource mix. And on the other side, the more intermittent ones. And as you go up the scale, going towards more distributed, like you'll find all of this others in terms of this arrangement, small biomass, rooftop solar, small scale batteries, storage. And then here on the top side, with the rising of the pro-consumers and the pro-mangers, it's this new world of demand side management and all of these other approaches and entries into the market of the pro-consumers and the pro-mangers coming in. Now, I don't think necessarily there's a reverse from where the war of the current started, but there's a new development all around that we would need to take care of. So how does this look also in our own context in South Africa? If you look at the division here, and we try and apply it to where we sit now, we do have Eskom generation sitting at the one point, Eskom transmission, distribution, with the same distributed energy resources here at the bottom. We've already got the large IPPs, small Munichs, where this is coming in. And then part of this embedded generation from where Munichs are busy playing in the field. And we've heard in the second session the work that Cape Town Metropolitan and what Ekurhuleni is doing, where there is 680 megawatts that they're trying to buy, and the various embedded activities of Cape Town. And then how this whole sector changes actually the way we are working, and how distributed energy resources appears to offer specific competitive alternatives in the future of many of today's utility services and the customers. So if we again look at the traditional value chain, I find this nice sketch where Pricewaterhouse put the traditional value chain in quite an interesting manner by putting the focus of a future business on a less integrated manner here in the left, where we still have in many areas a vertical bundled activities, where it's moving to less integrated, unbundled, from asset-based, heavy focus asset-based to a service-based industry. Now, of course, the electricity business is asset-centric. We'll never get away from asset-centric. But the way how our business is arranged is busy changing slowly from the evolving state of a business models into the new world. So if we think how this involvement of a private sector can take place, the world of transformation, there are more than one approach of how this participation can work. It can vary on the one side from 100% public ownership, where the ownership is 100% by the public sector, like what we have up to this point in time with Eskom and with many of the municipalities, up to the other point where it's 100% private ownership, like the IPPs. Interesting then that these kind of arrangements stretches over a period from short-term involvement to a longer-term involvement, from a, let's say, from a 3-4 years, 5 years arrangement up to a 25-30 years. Typically the tenure of an IPP, PPA sort of arrangements, with involvement of governments, from where we've started here at the bottom, that government says we need to do everything, from a point where the government more becomes the enabler. It reminds me, ladies and gentlemen, of an Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher, that I've said years ago, when a lot of the changes in the UK have started. She correctly pointed out, in my opinion, that the role of government is to govern, not to operate businesses. And that's my own words interpretation of that. But if you look at this particular elements here on the screen, I was also privileged to be part of a management contract and running a vertical entity in Africa. We've got various service contracts in South Africa alone for billing and part of retail services. And I've noted on the call quite a number of these participants, these service providers also sit with us today. And the various number of changes and possibilities within the sector. Concessions, we've got a distribution concession in South Africa, some others that is in the process of working towards that particular point. And here, build, operate, and own full divestiture the various IPPs. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me summarize this evolving features of an industry. We know customers are less captive, not monopoly anymore in all the areas, huge commercial incentives. The activities of that the load shedding, higher tariffs, the focus on clean energy, many cases the struggling for grid supply have led to greater awareness with many. With the new technologies coming in, have actually created a drive for change in many other areas. In many areas, this is for economic and environmental reasons, but our participants then go into strategic options and plans and focusing on taking care of the enabling environment, even if some of the regulatory and these aspects lag behind. Now, the elements that's important is, and I summarize this here on at the right-hand side. Let's note that we're becoming more distributed, more digitalized. The energy mix becomes more diversified, renewable energy, intermittent, and we're moving towards decarbonization. We've explained that in our second webinar, part 2 of this particular series. So very clearly, we're becoming much more integrated with other key sector resources and the infrastructure. We are not clearly demarcated in specific fields of generation, distribution, and transmission all bundled. And we view the networks different. So if I can try and summarize this in terms of what I believe is typically happening in South Africa, and let me try and be brave and put some pictures on the table how I see this could probably evolve in our sector, and let's then check our understanding and this developments with what is happening elsewhere in the world, with the learnings that we can bring in to focus our own focus on our business models going forward. In the picture that I'm sharing with you, we do have here at the right-hand side still Eskom bundled, still bundled from generation, distribution, with a transmission part, with a contestable customer, single buyer office. Let's call it an energy market with a bundled vertical Eskom still. Limited competition at this point in time versus the dominance of Eskom. New entries in terms of Schedule 2, exemption from Schedule 2, the reprogram up to number 4, but we know 4, 5, and the rest that we've heard in terms of announcements that is coming with. And then, of course, here in the 170 odd municipalities that's licensed, all horizontal monopolies where we've got wires and retail bundled. And then here at the bottom end, the rising of the pro-consumers and the pro-mangas, where I've split between the two, the one that is just for consumer buying mangas, that is coming in terms of some definitions, that is also bringing a heavy part of storage into the equation. Now, going forward, we know that Eskom will be unbundled. We're probably a monopoly part of transmission that will sit there. We will still have from these various IPs bilateral contracts with wheeling into a market. Market most probably would need to be regulated and unregulated, but there's numerous options, and we'll heard from Australia and from CPCS in Canada in the development and the sharing of the markets, how this probably could also unfold here in South Africa. Wheeling through, and then the imports specifically via the SAP that we've also heard in the first webinar, that is probably part of what will be with us. And then here at the bottom end, still our DIR, where we have a prosumers also part of a section. Now, one can continue with this by breaking this whole up further, saying, well, within this distribution sector, we've got the metros, we've got Eskom distribution. You may have a current arrangements, or we have some of these arrangements that I've alluded to, some service delivery agreements between them, where perhaps the stronger participants assist and help the more weaker ones. We could have the same kind of arrangement here from Eskom side. We can have some multi-jurisdictional service authorities in terms of a law currently available in South Africa, or this could even form part of a bundling where we may have some of the elements of an old RETS that was contemplated. Not perhaps the same, but part of it. Now, one can continue with this and define this, how it goes on, how a greater diversity mix comes in the future. Private sector participation also here in the distribution side. Unbundling services between the wires and the retail. And please remember this element where our participants share today what is happening elsewhere in the world, so that you can see how this could probably also be applicable to some of our learnings. Then another important one is the DSO, Distribution System Operator. Our participants today will also share with you how this can probably come into a picture of a fold of how we go forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, then I'm sharing with you. Then maybe if one try and look at mirror in the wall, what can happen in South Africa. I put this particular slide together, looking at the immediate where we are today with the known facts, then perhaps something in transition, defining this into 3 phases, a beginning part, a middle part, and say a third part, where we perhaps can evolve over time from a status quo through limited unbundling, further unbundling, up to a point where we may have the market and retail competition that was foreseen in the 1998 white paper, and also in the 2000 farm-in resolutions that went through cabinet that was stopped at that point in time. We may go through this route. If you say how long, I don't know. If I look at my crystal ball, it may be a 5 years, a 10 years, longer. We may have some stops. Some of the drivers that may accelerate this is the price and the reliability of electricity. Let's also hear from the learnings from our international players, what have happened elsewhere in the world with us. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being with us with the first part of a presentation. I'm going to hand over now to Leshan Moodliar of eThekwini. Before I start introducing part 2, he will take you through the poll, and I'm also going to stop sharing and hand over to the Secretariat to bring up the different poll questions that we would like to share. Last but not the least, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, I see you've already added them in the chat box in the question and answers. Please feel free to bring them up and to share with us all. We will use them when we go into the panel discussion going over. Leshan, to you.
Perfect, and thank you, Art. Colleagues, it's a very good morning to you all. So we've heard quite clearly from Art talking about the theoretical concepts around business models and very, very interesting to see the evolving business models and the sort of emerging trends that's coming out from the sector. The one thing I can tell you that came out quite clearly from Art's presentation is that there's complex changes going on, and those complex changes now requires a complex response, not only from us as municipalities, but I think also from you as a sector as well. In the next few presentations that are coming up, we're going to look at the practical aspects in terms of dealing with some of these complex challenges. And there are 4 presenters, and we're hoping then to take away some ideas in terms of how best we could deal with some of these issues. But for today in the session, we wanted to balance out the theory together with the practical. And we also wanted to have you input as participants in this session today. So to have your views and your interpretations, we have set up a survey, which I'm hoping that Dion would bring on screen right now, where we have identified 15 challenges that we believe are very influential in sustaining municipalities going forward. And we would like then for you to please participate in the survey and for you to rank these challenges in order of importance in your view or in your interpretation. So for example, if I could just take you through the first one as an example, if you look at revenue management and the ability for us to recover billed revenue and pay suppliers, in your view, do you think that this is important for municipal sustainability? And if yes, you could click 1. If you feel it's not important or it's least important, then you can click 10. So we've allowed you a rating scale from 1 to 10, and obviously that will indicate a lower level of importance as you move to number 10. So yeah, colleagues, please do participate and give us your input. We would like then to collate the results at the end of the 4th presenter, which is the Eskom presentation. So when you see the Eskom presenter coming up, please ensure that you start to finalize in your submissions. And we're hoping then to bring the results into the panel discussion, where we would open it up for general discussion. So if there's any questions or if there's any queries, you may raise your hands. But if not, look, I'll see you guys then in the panel discussion. Thanks.
Leshan, thank you very much. Colleagues, so if I may take you now into the next part of the presentation, our panel discussion. Our panel discussion is divided in 4 themes. The first theme is around specifically business models, looking at it from a legal and a regulatory point. Then the second one is the UK example that have led private sector participation a long time ago with a privatization drive, and theme 3. I thought let's concentrate specifically in a deeper dive on the markets, because this is what has been foreseen in the amended era coming forward. A lot of changes that we need to take cognizance for. And then the last one with us, also Eskom, that will come in with a specific focus on the distribution system operator and the distribution going forward. So then theme 1, and I'm going to ask Hamilton Locke to get ready. A hearty word of welcome from my side to Matt Bamgurtel and Adrian van der Merwe from a law firm, Hamilton Locke. Hamilton Locke is an Asia Pacific law firm with, amongst others, a specific sector focus in energy. They have extensive experience in guiding clients through the development, financing, and construction of projects such as oil and gas, fossil and renewable generation, transmission and distribution. We have worked across Africa, Asia, Australia, gained extensive knowledge in the legal frameworks underpinning these markets and the changes and in regulation. You'll hear from when we share with us that the focus in the team is new energy, suggesting also part of a moving away from the fossil fuel part in the decarbonization drive, specifically focusing on what I agree, trying to make the world a better place from where we find it today and looking at something around the new ones. I think this evolvement in many places around the world, and specifically what I understand and know what is happening in Australia and in Asia Pacific, give them a unique perspective from which they can provide some insights and share with us learnings. This is, ladies and gentlemen, specifically true because there's quite a lot of similarities between Australia and South Africa, not only in our coal field and in the coal generation. Our generation coal requirements looks in Australia and also in South Africa, but also because where Australia sit around about 1.5 to 2 decades, 20 years back, and us today in South Africa, a lot of similarities. I believe these learnings would be of great value to us, so that where we can bypass some of them, that we don't make the same mistakes that have come up in the system in Australia. So I stop now sharing.